Good morning, students. This is science class for class 4. So, if you remember, yesterday we have already started with the last chapter of your half yearly syllabus, that is light. We have already discussed what is light. We have discussed luminous object and non-luminous object. So, today our discussion will be on the sources of light. Sources of light. What are the sources of light? First, you have to understand what do you mean by sources of light. Sources of light means the place from where we get light, we obtain light. Light is produced from some sources, and the objects that produce or emit lights are called sources of light. So light is produced from some sources, from some object, and the objects that emit light, that gives out light, are known as sources of light. For example, sun, tube light, bulb, candle, they are sources from where we get light. From wherever we get light, they are known as sources of light. And these sources of light can be of two types: natural sources of light and artificial sources of light. So these sources of light can be natural sources of light and artificial sources of light. So natural sources of light and artificial sources of light. Natural sources of light is where which is actually made by God. The universe has created that. Means the sources of light which is created by God. And artificial sources of lights are sources which are made by human being, and from where we get light. So let us study. Light is produced from some source, and the objects that produce, which gives out light, is known as sources of light. There are two different sources of light on the earth. They are natural and artificial. So there are two different sources from where we get light. Some are natural and some are artificial, man-made. Natural sources of light are the sources of light that occur naturally and emit light of their own. So natural sources of light are those sources from where we get light, which gives out light, and it is created by God. It is naturally created. The sun is the major source of light on the earth. So the biggest source of light is the sun. Sun is that source from where the whole world gets light. It not only produces light, but it also produces heat at the same time. So sun is the biggest source of light which provides light to the whole world. It is of great importance for all the living things. The moon and the stars are the other example of natural sources of light. That means these are the sources from where we get light, which is not made by human. It is naturally created. That means the God has created it. Stars produce light, but a very little amount of it reaches the earth's surface because of the large distance between the earth and the stars. Stars, they also produce light, but very small amount of light reaches the earth. Why? Because the distance from the earth and the star is huge, is too much, and that is why the star does not produce too much light which reaches the earth. Like the distance is so much that by the time it reaches the earth, it produces a very little amount of light. The moon provides light during the night time, but it does not emit light of its own. Even in the night you will see the moon produce light. But remember, the light that it produces, that it gives, is not the light of its own. It actually absorbs the light, it actually reflects the light of the sun. The light from the moon is actually the reflected sunlight. That means what we say is that it absorbs the light from the sun and then it gives the light of that. So moon does not have light of its own. It releases the light of the sun. Some living organisms like fireflies, jellyfish and glowworms also have the ability to produce light. So there are few living things which has which has the capacity to produce the light of its own. For example, you can say fireflies, jellyfish, then you have glowworms. So you must have seen, especially fireflies are very common. You will see in the night, they produce light, they have a light at the back of its body and it can fly. So there are some living things which can create light of its own. So I hope you have understood natural sources of light. Okay. Now living things, why did the living things? Living things are also natural because they are not created by us, they are not created by human being. Next is artificial sources of light. That means the light that is given out, that is emitted, the sources which gives out light, which emits light, those sources are made by human being and are called artificial sources. Artificial sources of light are the light sources that are made by human to produce light, that are created by human. Like for example, torch, bulb, candle, they are made by human being. For what? So that they can produce light, so that they can emit light. Electric bulb, tube lights, torch, lamp, candle and laser lights are some example of artificial sources of light. So these are some examples which are actually made by human being so that they can give out light, so that they can create light. So I hope all of you have understood these sources of light. Sources of light, let me remind you again, from where we get light. They can be of two types, natural as well as artificial. Natural, that occurs naturally and are created by God. Artificial, that are created by human being. So children, please read this paragraph, and if you cannot understand anything, you can ask me in the online classes. So for today, up to this much. Thank you, class.